At the Australian Open, there's an unspoken rule everyone understands. Attention follows trophies. Cameras chase Grand Slam champions. Crowds fill arenas for world number ones. Press conferences for legends rarely break a sweat in the algorithm. And then, suddenly, that rule broke. Because this year, the most watched press conference at the Australian Open didn't belong to a reigning champion. It didn't belong to Novak Djokovic. It didn't belong to Carlos Alcaraz. It didn't even belong to a player seated anywhere near the top. It belonged to a 20-year-old who hasn't won a Grand Slam. A player ranked far below the stars she's outdrawing. A name many casual American fans had barely heard before this tournament. Alex Eala. Before she even stepped onto court, more than 170,000 people tuned in just to hear her speak. That number quietly stunned people inside the tournament. Because in modern tennis, attention like that is supposed to be earned after titles, not before them. So here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to say out loud yet. Is Alex Eala becoming a star faster than tennis is ready for? Former world #1 Andy Roddick noticed it immediately. Not just the numbers, the energy, the packed stands, the way crowds leaned in when she walked on court, the way her presence shifted the atmosphere in matches she wasn't even favored to win. Tournament organizers noticed too. So did sponsors. So did other players. Because attention is power, and power changes the sport. In an era where highlights travel faster than results, where social media clips sometimes matter more than scorelines, tennis is facing a new reality. Fans don't just follow rankings anymore. They follow stories. They follow connection. They follow someone who feels like theirs. And Alex Eala checks every one of those boxes. But attention comes with a cost. For every cheer, there's expectation. For every viral clip, there's pressure. And for a player still building her game, the spotlight doesn't wait until you're ready. It demands answers now. Can she turn this moment into greatness? Or is the tennis world watching the beginning of a burden that's too heavy, too early? Because what's happening here isn't just about one young player. It's about how modern tennis creates stars, and what it does to them once it does. If you want to understand how influence is starting to rival trophies in professional tennis, and why Alex Eala might be the clearest sign of that shift, make sure you're following Pro Tennis 360. This story isn't finished. In many ways, it's just getting started. The attention started before the matches did. Long before Alex Eala ever hit her first ball at this year's Australian Open, something unusual was already happening behind the scenes. Coaches were whispering. Media teams were adjusting schedules. And tournament staff were quietly watching numbers climb in places they normally didn't. Press conference views. Not match highlights. Not dramatic wins. Just a player sitting at a microphone, answering routine questions, and pulling in over 170,000 views before the tournament had even found its rhythm. To put that into perspective, those numbers didn't just edge past expectations. They completely eclipsed what established champions were drawing at the same event. For insiders, that wasn't a coincidence. It was a signal. Because attention like that doesn't come from rankings. It comes from momentum. Alex Eala arrived in Melbourne carrying something far heavier than a tennis bag. She arrived as a symbol for Filipino fans around the world. She wasn't just another competitor in the draw. She was representation, visibility, proof that someone from their country belonged on one of tennis's biggest stages. And they showed up in the stands, online, on social media, in comment sections that exploded every time her name appeared on a graphic. Clips of her warm-ups circulated faster than match results. Casual fans who hadn't followed tennis in years suddenly knew exactly when she was scheduled to play. Tournament organizers noticed too, because packed stands change everything. They change broadcast energy. They change sponsor interest. They even change how matches feel to the players involved. This is where tennis quietly started to bend. For decades, the sport followed a rigid hierarchy. Titles created stars, and stars attracted fans. But Eala flipped that order. The fans came first. The spotlight followed. And suddenly, the tennis world had to react to a player whose influence was outpacing her resume. That creates tension, not just externally, but internally. Because while the crowd noise grows louder, the margin for error shrinks. Every unforced error feels heavier. Every loss feels amplified. And for a young player still carving out her game, the line between inspiration and pressure becomes dangerously thin. What makes this moment even more complicated is Eala's own awareness of it. She hasn't leaned into the hype. She hasn't declared herself the future of the sport. In fact, she's gone out of her way to downplay expectations, reminding reporters that she's still learning, still growing, still chasing consistency. But tennis doesn't slow down just because you ask it to. Once attention locks onto you, it doesn't wait for results to catch up. It demands them. And that's the real story unfolding here. Not whether Alex Eala can win matches, but whether modern tennis is setting her up to carry something far bigger than a scoreboard can measure. When star power starts to outrank rankings. At some point during the first week of the tournament, the conversation around Alex Eala quietly shifted. It stopped being about her draw. It stopped being about her technique. And it started being about scheduling. Inside tennis, scheduling is never neutral. Primetime slots are currency. They're reserved for players who move tickets, drive ratings, and keep sponsors happy. Traditionally, that privilege belongs to champions, players with trophies that justify the spotlight. But Alex Eala was forcing a different conversation. Andy Roddick put it bluntly on his podcast. He didn't talk about forehands or footwork. He talked about crowds, about how people come out for their stars, regardless of ranking. And in Melbourne, the evidence was impossible to ignore. When Eala played, the atmosphere changed. The stands filled faster. The noise rose earlier. The energy felt different. That matters more than fans realize. Because tournaments don't just sell tennis. They sell experience. And when one player consistently delivers a louder, fuller arena than higher-ranked opponents, the math becomes uncomfortable. Do you reward the better resume? Or do you reward the player who brings the audience? This is where tennis starts to crack along philosophical lines. Purists argue that merit must come first, that the sport loses its soul the moment popularity outweighs performance. But organizers live in a different reality. Broadcast deals, sponsorships, and global reach all depend on engagement. And engagement doesn't always follow rankings anymore. Alex Eala exists right at that fault line. Her matches aren't just watched, they're anticipated. Fans don't stumble upon them. They plan for them. That kind of anticipation is rare, especially for a player still early in her career. And once it exists, it's almost impossible for the system to ignore. But there's a cost to being the exception. Every time a player receives attention perceived as unearned, resentment builds. From fans of established stars. From players grinding for years without similar recognition. And sometimes from within the locker room itself. Suddenly, a young athlete isn't just competing against opponents. She's competing against a narrative. One that questions whether she belongs in the spotlight she's standing in. That's the invisible weight Alex Eala is carrying now. Because once star power begins to outrank rankings, the spotlight stops being a reward. It becomes a test. And tennis has a long history of watching young players struggle under exactly that kind of pressure. The crowd effect no one talks about. There's a moment in tennis that rarely shows up in highlight reels. It happens between points, between serves. In the half second when a player looks up and feels the crowd leaning one way or another. That's where matches quietly shift. When Alex Eala steps onto court, that shift is immediate. The applause arrives early. The reactions are louder. Mistakes draw sympathy instead of silence. Winners trigger eruptions that feel disproportionate to the scoreline. And for her opponents, that environment can be disorienting. Alicia Parks experienced it firsthand. On paper, it was just another match. But on court, the dynamic told a different story. The crowd wasn't neutral. They weren't politely appreciative. They were invested. And that kind of investment has consequences. Players talk about it privately all the time. How crowd energy speeds you up. How it rushes decisions. How it makes routine shots feel heavier than they should. For the player being supported, it can lift you through tough moments. For the player on the other side, it can feel like playing uphill. This is the psychological layer of tennis that statistics don't capture. Social media amplifies it even further. Clips of Eala interacting with fans, laughing during practice, answering questions with humility and ease. These moments circulate far beyond tennis circles, pulling in viewers who may not care about rankings, but care deeply about connection. And connection builds loyalty. That loyalty follows her onto the court. It turns neutral spectators into partisans. It creates an environment where every match feels like a statement, not just a result. But here's the danger. When the crowd becomes part of the story, it also becomes part of the pressure. Because now, every loss isn't just personal. It feels collective. Like letting people down. Like failing an expectation you didn't explicitly ask for, but can't escape. For a young player, that emotional feedback loop can be exhausting. You don't just recover physically after a match like that. You recover mentally. You replay moments not because of the score, but because of the reaction. The cheers you lived up to. The ones you didn't. Alex Eala is learning this in real time. She's discovering that influence changes the emotional terrain of competition. That being loved can be just as demanding as being doubted. And that the crowd, once it chooses you, never really lets go. Humility in the middle of the hype. What makes Alex Eala's rise even more complicated is how little she seems interested in fueling it. While the tennis world debates her impact, she's doing the opposite of what history suggests. She's not declaring a rival. She's not chasing headlines. In interviews, she consistently redirects attention away from herself, insisting she's still far from the level of the sport's elite. That humility isn't performative. It's strategic. Because she understands something many young stars don't. That hype can get ahead of reality faster than development ever can. And once that gap forms, it becomes dangerous. Inside the locker room, players notice who embraces the spotlight and who tries to outrun it. Eala has chosen the latter. She speaks about improvement, not destiny. About learning, not entitlement. And that approach quietly earns respect in a space that can be unforgiving to perceived shortcuts. But humility doesn't cancel expectation. The world doesn't slow down just because a player asks it to. Sponsors still watch engagement metrics. Organizers still track ticket sales. Fans still want more. And the narrative keeps building whether the player participates in it or not. This creates an internal conflict that rarely gets discussed. On one side, there's gratitude for the support, the attention, the opportunity to inspire an entire nation. On the other, there's fear of being defined too early, of being judged against standards you haven't had time to reach. Every practice session becomes a referendum. Every match, a measurement. Not just a skill, but of whether the hype was justified. That's an exhausting way to grow. Yet this is the reality of modern tennis. The sport doesn't just develop athletes anymore. It accelerates identities. And Alex Eala is navigating that acceleration with caution, even as the world around her presses harder on the gas. The question now isn't whether she can handle the spotlight today. It's whether tennis will allow her the time it usually grants, or whether influence has rewritten that rule forever. When sponsors start caring more about views than victories, there's a moment in every sport when the business side quietly steps in and changes the stakes. In tennis, that moment usually arrives after a player wins something big. A breakout title, a deep Grand Slam run, proof that success can be monetized. With Alex Eala, that timeline has been flipped. Sponsors didn't wait for trophies. They watched engagement. They watched clips rack up views. They watched press conferences outperform match highlights. And in today's sports economy, that data speaks louder than rankings ever could. Because brands don't invest in potential champions anymore. They invest in attention. This is where modern tennis starts to feel unfamiliar. A player doesn't need to dominate scoreboards to dominate conversations. If fans are watching, sharing, commenting, and emotionally buying in, the commercial engine starts turning on its own. For someone like Eala, that creates opportunity and risk at the same time. On one hand, early visibility opens doors most players have to wait years to reach. On the other, it creates a subtle shift in expectations. Once sponsors arrive, performance stops being just about wins and losses. It becomes about maintaining relevance, staying visible, feeding the momentum machine. That's a dangerous balancing act for any athlete, let alone a 20-year-old still building her game. Because sponsorship attention doesn't pause for development cycles. It doesn't understand slumps or growing pains. It rewards consistency in engagement, not patience in progress. And when commercial interest arrives early, it can quietly pressure athletes to become brands before they fully become competitors. Tennis has seen this story before. Young players elevated too fast, marketed too heavily, asked to carry narratives they hadn't earned yet. Some thrived, many didn't. The difference often came down to whether the system around them protected their growth or exploited their moment. With Alex Eala, the question is still unanswered. She's standing at the intersection of sport and spectacle, where every appearance carries value beyond the result. And while that visibility can fund careers, it can also distort priorities if it arrives before a foundation is fully set. Right now, the numbers look good. The interest is high. The momentum is real. But tennis history suggests that what matters most isn't how fast attention arrives. It's how well a player is shielded from it when things inevitably slow down. The locker room reaction no one films. What fans see is applause. What they don't see is the locker room. Inside that space, tennis operates on a different set of rules. Respect is earned slowly. Recognition is measured quietly. And hype is often met with skepticism until results force acceptance. For Alex Eala, walking into that environment with outsized attention is a delicate experience. Veteran players notice everything. Who gets cameras? Who gets better time slots? Who draws crowds despite ranking? And while most will never say it publicly, early attention can create distance before a word is ever exchanged. Not hostility, distance. Because tennis players spend years grinding in anonymity. Long flights, empty courts, minimal coverage. When someone bypasses that phase, even unintentionally, it challenges an unspoken hierarchy the sport has lived by for decades. That doesn't mean resentment is guaranteed, but it does mean pressure multiplies. Suddenly, every match becomes symbolic. Wins confirm the narrative. Losses invite scrutiny. And the locker room, fair or not, watches closely to see which direction things tilt. This is where mental resilience becomes more important than raw talent. Young players often talk about pressure from fans and media. But the quieter pressure, the sense that you're being evaluated by peers who've paid their dues, can be heavier. It forces you to prove that attention wasn't a fluke, that you belong not just on the poster, but in the profession. Eala seems aware of this dynamic. She doesn't demand space. She doesn't posture. She keeps her head down, focusing on work instead of narrative. That approach matters. Because in tennis, credibility inside the locker room often determines how long outside attention lasts. Respect stabilizes careers. Hype alone doesn't. If Alex Eala can convert visibility into consistent competitiveness, the locker room will shift. It always does. But until then, she's navigating an invisible test, one where silence often speaks louder than applause. And passing that test takes time. What happens when the spotlight moves on? There's an uncomfortable truth in modern sports that rarely gets addressed honestly. Attention is loyal until isn't. The same algorithms that lift players up can move on overnight. A new storyline, a new face, a different controversy. And suddenly, the spotlight that felt permanent starts to fade. For Alex Eala, that moment will come, not because she failed, but because attention always shifts. The real test won't be how she performs when everyone's watching. It will be how she responds when fewer people are. This is where long-term careers are separated from viral moments. Players who rely on hype often struggle, when silence returns. Players who build structure, training habits, mental routines, support systems. Use that quiet to get better. And when attention circles back, they're ready to meet it on their terms. That's the fork in the road Eala is approaching. Right now, the world is loud. Expectations are high. The narrative is generous. But the next chapters will be written in matches without packed stands and in weeks without headlines. That's not a warning. It's an opportunity. Because growth loves anonymity. It thrives when mistakes aren't dissected and progress isn't rushed. And if Alex Eala can use this moment to lay a foundation instead of chasing validation, the attention she's earned now will feel earned again later. This time through results. Tennis history favors patience. It always has. The sport doesn't reward early peaks nearly as much as it rewards sustained ascent. And while influence may open doors, consistency keeps them open. Whether fans realize it or not, this is the phase they won't see, but will eventually feel. In tighter matches, in calmer body language, in decisions made under pressure that reflect experience, not excitement. If and when that happens, the story around Alex Eala will shift again. Not from hype to doubt, but from curiosity to credibility. And that's when attention becomes something different entirely. From hype to legacy, or something in between. So what are we really watching with Alex Eala? Not a finished product, not a guaranteed champion, but a case study in how modern tennis creates and tests its stars. She represents a new reality where influence can arrive early, expectations form fast, and development happens under a microscope. That reality isn't fair, but it's here. And how players respond to it will shape the future of the sport. Alex Eala hasn't won the titles yet. She hasn't reached the peaks the spotlight suggests. But she's navigating something just as difficult. Growing in public without letting the noise define her. That's rare. Whether she becomes a Grand Slam champion or not, her journey is already forcing tennis to confront uncomfortable questions about attention, merit, and patience. And the answers won't come quickly. They'll come point by point, loss by loss, adjustment by adjustment. If you want to keep following how modern tennis is changing, and how players like Alex Eala are learning to survive and evolve within it, make sure you subscribe to Pro Tennis 360. Because the most important chapters of this story aren't behind us. They haven't even been played yet.